In this episode, I'm going to talk about one of the very few female performers of sound poetry at the beginning of the 20th century. That is the Baroness Elsa von Freytag Loringhoven. Of course, there were female artists participating in the avant-garde of the early 20th century, such as Emmy Hennings. She was a pillar of the cabaret Voltaire and a very accomplished performer. But as far as we know, she was no practitioner of sound poetry. It sounds ironic that Elsa von Freytag Loringhoven used the aristocratic title Baroness, when in reality she was a penniless artist making a paltry living out of modeling and art, unable to publish most of her work in her lifetime, and ended her life in poverty. She took the title from one of her marriages to a baron that later would die. She learned her trade as actor and model in Germany, and eventually she moved to the United States. After several years, she ended in New York in 1910 and joined a group of artists called New York Dada, who gathered around the gallery 241. This group included artists such as Marcel Duchamp, Man Ray, William Carlos Williams, Francis Picabia, Arthur Cravan, Jane Heap, and others. When this group relocated to Paris and joined the Dadaists and Surrealists Tristan Tzara and André Breton, the Baroness was left behind, unable to get a visa. It would be only later in 1923 that she was able to travel to Europe. Elsa von Freytag Loringhoven was a unique artist, radical, controversial, a real provocateur. In her own words, art is shameless. She made no distinctions between art and life, between her body and art. She created the costumes that she wore in her modeling and also in the streets, causing her no end of scandal and encounters with the law. She wore spoon earrings, black lipstick, and tomato cans attached to her breasts. She also created ready-mades, works of art made of manufactured objects. And there is ongoing controversy about one of the most famous ready-mades, the fountain, the upside-down urinal attributed to Marcel Duchamp, which is considered by some to be her creation. Our interest lies in her poetry. She only managed to publish 31 poems in her lifetime, mainly in small avant-garde publications such as the Little Review, edited by Jane Heap, or The Liberator, edited by Claude Mackay. The fact that she published so few poems in her life maybe can be explained by the fact that editors, after the scandal that followed the publication of James Joyce's Ulysses, were very cautious of getting into legal problems if they published her highly charged sexual poems asserting the power of female desire. The novelist Dune Barnes was her most ardent patron, literary agent and friend. They even collaborated in a collection of poetry that, despite their efforts, was never published. The Baroness wrote word poems in her beautiful calligraphy. She used the page as a canvas for visual poems and graphics, and she also wrote sound poetry. Her poetry fuses, combines, mixes, borrows, collages, parodies, consumer products, advertisement slogans, and resembles Kurt Schwitter's collages. Her sound poetry was an extension of her body, and here is where it lays the main distinction between her sound poetry and the sound poetry of other practitioners. Her body was the main focus of her art. She adorned her body Transformed into a daily performance, her modeling was in itself a performance. She had her pictures taken, notably by Man Ray. In the same vein, she used the noises of her bodily functions in her sound poetry, love-making, spitting, coughing, laughing, etc. She wrote to Barnes saying that sound was very important for her, and that becomes very obvious in her sound poetry. She used noises of her bodily functions next to onomatopoeic sounds from machines, urban noises, animals. She used sounds from her native German. She invented portmanteau words such as man quake, harvest moon, magnet soul. Her sound poetry is completely consistent with all her artwork, as everything is integrated and also radiates from her body. Although there are no recordings of her performing her own poetry, there are some accounts of her throaty voice and raucous recitations. Responses to her sound poetry were clearly divided between those who thought that she was completely insane and those who thought that she was championing a new corporeal language. A critic in the 1920s wrote a review about her sound poem, Klink hatte Venga, in which he explained that this sound poem had the virtues of many languages and the deficiencies of none, since through them the author creates sounds for shades of meaning that have no dictionary equivalents. In many ways, the Baroness' artwork and standing are so unique that they can be understood as one of a kind, and not as part of a continuum or a school or a movement. Despite this uniqueness, there is a very good chance that her sound poetry was influenced by another Elsa, Elsa Lasker-Schuller, during her early years in Germany before she moved to the United States. Elsa Lasker-Schuller experimented at the beginning of the century with an invented language. She created a pseudo-Arabic and pseudo-Latin mixed with German words, and following the Oriental fashion of the time, she created a character called Tino of Baghdad that spoke this pseudo-language. Elsa Lasker-Schuller wore pseudo-Oriental costumes for her character Tino of Baghdad, and it's very likely that the Baroness knew of her. Although her pseudo-Oriental invented language is only mentioned as a footnote in sound poetry overviews, since it was clearly meant for more theatrical entertainment audiences, it is worth mentioning that the creation of a pseudo-language, like the pseudo-Oriental language created by Lasker-Schuller, can create notions of territory or the lack of it, and it deserves due attention. To summarize, whereas some sound poets created sound poetry to reject the language of journalism and jingoism that promoted wars and oppression, such is the case of Hugo Ball, that rejected rational language, or other artists tried to create an emotional Esperanto that spoke to all humankind, like in the case of Klevinov, and others like Marinetti, their aim was to create the language of the future. The Baroness' sound poetry was unique insofar that she was trying to give voice to her body, the real canvas of her art. Her sound poetry is an extension of her body in the form of sound. For her, writing sound poetry was no different from adorning or painting her body. It was a corporeal language. And now I'm going to do an interpretation of one of her sound poems. Kling Hraces venga. Ildrich mit zonga hasta toch. Ninj ifeniek, Ar, kar, bar, carar, bar, arcar, mardar, mardador de dar, mardador dar, mardo va his niek, gorde me nis, gorde me, narin tarismani, narin zarismangi, hasi o vrr. Cardis boforde, hadorde klosnux, clarismaniges, alquile, masreje, paquille, oyombe, oze, narin zarismangi, ve o vrr, bevromjes, o bromjes, brum.